Welcome to the second episode of Shaina's Stories. Before we dive in here, I want to give you a heads up that these stories are not in any chronological order. I don't know how these stories are really going to manifest. I'm trusting this process, and I believe that they'll unfold the way that they were supposed to. So the hope, though, is that they'll have some meaning to those tuning in some way, shape, or form. So let me dive right into this first story. And I do want you to know that this first story might sound like it's chronological because it kind of starts at the beginning, but really it just was intuitively where I needed to go with this. So the summer of 1995 was a pretty rough one. I was almost 8 years old, and over the course of 1 month, two things happened to me that changed the course of my life. The first was the death of my maternal grandmother. So I was 7 and I was about a month away from my 8th birthday. And so I didn't really understand what was going on. My internal system, though, apparently did, and it had kept that experience and has been dangling it in my face periodically for forever. And it still continues to this day. And the second thing was me being diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. So let me recap for you. I'm 7, almost 8, and in the span of that month, I lost my grandmother, who was the only grandmother I really knew. And then I was diagnosed with a life-changing illness. So I'm not going to start with my grandma today because I truly believe that that is a story that's going to unfold as we go through Shaina's stories. So I want to start with the CF, the cystic fibrosis today. There's not much of a story here. Like I said, this is kind of the backdrop because I don't remember a lot of it. I do remember two things, however, that happened on that day. One was me going to McDonald's with my mom and being at the Children's Hospital because Abbott and Children's in Minneapolis is shared. And so there was a McDonald's down there. So I remember that piece. And I remember my doctor handing me pills and telling me that you're going to need to take these every time that you eat in order to gain weight. Now, to an 8-year-old girl, saying you're going to gain weight by taking these pills isn't exactly a good selling point. I had no interest in taking pills, but I digress. So essentially, within one day, I went from being a typical 8-year-old or 7-year-old, and now was having to do things that I didn't really understand at that moment. But looking back, it was a pretty big fucking deal. I didn't feel sick, so it was very confusing to me. I had just gotten home from camp. So I had spent the summer, I had spent a week away at sleepaway camp. I got my dog Brandy that summer, which was a good thing. I had sleepovers with friends. I had just enjoyed life being a kid at that age. And so when you get this big diagnosis, all of a sudden things change. Your thoughts, your feelings, like you don't really understand what it all means. And yet you do because you go home and all of a sudden you have to take on all of these things that you didn't have to before. It really is amazing how one day can change everything. And now I realize that it's traumatizing, to say the least, to wake up one morning not knowing that what's going to happen to you that day is life altering. And that happens in so many different ways in people's lives that you just don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. But after that day, I no longer got to just have sleepovers with friends without having to think about my medical treatments. I couldn't eat a meal without pills, otherwise I was going to be super sick. But what I find interesting is how is it that before that I didn't have, maybe I don't remember. Okay, I digress. And I couldn't just go straight to bed at night. And that was like a big thing that affects me even today. Sometimes I just want to sleep. I don't want to have to think about my treatment. I don't want to have to think about all of the pills that I have to take. Like, I don't, unless you have a chronic illness, sometimes you don't really, and people don't understand what it means to have to take this all on and also try to live a normal life, whatever that looks like. In the beginning, when I was first diagnosed, my parents literally had to pound on my chest 2 times a day. I think this is the parts that I don't always remember. Um, and it felt like torture to someone who's 8 years old having to have someone pound on your back and on your chest, and ugh, it was just awful. Um, but that was my life now. I had to do all these things, and luckily, Western medicine and things have changed. But in the beginning, all you know is like, why do I have to do all of these things? And there's grief there. There's a loss because for me, I was born with it because it's in my genetics, but I wasn't born knowing that I had it. So up until that last month of my 7th year, I was living that normal life. And so I know what it was like to be typical. And then all of a sudden I wasn't. And that there is a grief there, there is a process, and I'm still going through it. And I think somehow you have to learn to move forward. And I think that's what people think of as strength, because it's like, well, what other option is there? Am I going to just sit there and wallow? I guess I could. I guess some people make that decision. I did not. And so I tried to live my life as best I could. Um, and I think people experience this kind of situation that I'm expressing in different ways, even today with COVID. I mean, there's a lot of tragedy that has caused. And in my life, which I'm sure you'll notice as we kind of go forward in all of my stories, is that I have a lot of anger. And I'm in the process of kind of working through that. Um, and what do we do with that anger? I can't change the fact that I was diagnosed with CF. It's my reality, unfortunately. But as I found a quote by Joseph Goldstein, and he stated, "You can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf." Shit happens in our lives, and you can let that anger and resentment fester and take over, or you can use that hurt and that grief to do something powerful. I chose to surf. Thank you for tuning in to my second episode of Shaina's Stories. Keep tuning in because there's more to hear. Thank you.